lightly. There we go. Hope you all doing well. This is going to be one of our first of the YouTube live stream series. We're going to start doing more public YouTube live streams now. Before we did a lot of just Patreon live streams, which we're still doing those. And so today I just want to answer a few questions, talk a little bit more about this channel and what we're hoping to achieve now that we have a little bit of a larger following. So we want to address those and just let you know that I'm available as a resource. So we got quite a few questions that came across, so I'll answer those. I'm going to wait a few more minutes just to make sure everyone can get in here, all right? Let me know in the comments below if you are drinking tea, and if so, which tea are you drinking? I'm going to be drinking a ripe Pu-erh today, a wild ripe, which is kind of a blend of that lighter fermentation. This is a 2013 wild ripe. So I'm going to get my kettle ready, my gaiwan ready. I'm going to wait a few more minutes for people to come in, and then we can start getting into it. I did just get my booster on Saturday morning, and I was feeling quite out of it. So hopefully I can last this whole hour. This tea should help me. But thanks for joining. I'm excited to spend some time with you all and drink some tasty teas. And I'm going to have my fancy dancy YouTube light, right? That's all the rage. All the rage. There we go. So feel free to let me know questions below, things you want me to address in this live stream. So first, I want to address on the question. We get this a lot. People will reach out to me on Instagram or YouTube on why I don't mention the tea I'm drinking, the brand, the name of the tea in my YouTube videos. And there's a very specific reason on why I don't do that. It's because I want the channel to be focused on education and critical thinking rather than the tea I am drinking. And I don't want that to clutter the thought process of the information we're learning about. I think there are just too many conflicting things when you start to see a particular tea or mention a tea. People kind of jump to certain conclusions. So I wanted to avoid that. And that is why I don't mention the teas I'm drinking on my YouTube videos. Now, if you want to know the teas I'm drinking and how to buy teas and where to find teas, we do all that on my Patreon. But I just wanted to address that question. And then I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of this channel, because it is a little bit different. I haven't really seen anything like it yet, and there's a reason for that as well. I think there's a lot of people in the tea community already that focus on tea history, tea culture, tea philosophy, the way of tea, drinking tea, right? And I think there's a lot of that information already. And so this channel is not trying to touch on those subjects. This channel is only focused on the understanding the quality of the raw material we are drinking. That's the core focus of this channel, right? Giving tools to you all to understand what is the actual quality of the tea I'm drinking, because I mentioned before, Pu-erh is a buyer's beware market. So that is the purpose of this channel. That's why it's a little bit different. And I don't get too much into the philosophy, and at times it can seem quite serious, because I'm just trying to come at a non-biased way of approaching tea, understanding what is the tea I'm actually drinking. Is it really what it says it is? Is it really ancient arbor, gushu, yesheng tea? And we could have a whole conversation about, does that matter? What are those terms? Yeah, most of the time they're marketing, unfortunately. But I really wanted to dive deep into that world and really understand, is there a way we could do technical analysis, fundamental analysis of the tea, and to build our skill set in understanding what's the tea we're drinking. So that's the focus of this channel, and I hope that's what it's achieving. We're going to be posting videos more frequently now, once or twice a month now. Short, 8 to 10 minute videos going into some of the technical analysis systems I use when addressing tea. And so I'm really excited to share that all with you. So let's get into it. We got some questions. So thanks for joining. Matthew, hey, can you speak on how to store Pu-erh long term, especially tong wrapped in bamboo leaves? That's great. So I'm going to get to that question right after these other two questions that were submitted before the live, but that's a fantastic question. Emoji stack of peaches. That's true. We're trying to get up and running the emojis for YouTube. I'm still new to all this, but we should have custom emojis for YouTube subscribers to this channel. Hopefully we'll have that up and running next month. We vote on those emojis in the Patreon. So we got a question on tea jars. So this is actually a good transition, I think, to your Tong question. Tea jars. What is the best jar to store tea in? Yixing, porcelain, ceramic, clay, and should I be breaking up my tea cakes if I want to consume them? So there's a lot of tea jars, and you see I use a lot of tea jars. Fundamentally, first off, I think if you're going to be storing tea for the long term, right, we're talking a few years, it is always better to store them in the cake format, right, compression, right? It's creating its own microclimate. It's very beneficial for the aging process to stay in that format. Better yet, right, in the Tong, right, because then it's really creating its own microclimate, and maybe if you're a little crazy, maybe the original case, right? So that's obviously the best for long term, and we'll get into more into that about, you know, storage condition and humidity in a moment. Now, tea jars. I use tea jars a lot, and I particularly have a bias towards porcelain or ceramic jars because they are, if you can be assured of the quality, right? We want to make sure the raw material of the jar we're using is clean, right? I know that sounds a little funny, but what is the glaze they're using, right? Is it an expensive glaze? Was the jar relatively cheap from an unknown store? I don't know where it's from. Maybe that's concerning. Is there any strange aromas in the porcelain or glaze or the jar, right? So it should be natural and clean, good quality. I like porcelain because it's not quite airtight. You'll notice that some porcelain jars are actually not glazed on the edge of where they kind of connect. And so they limit airflow drastically, but there still is some airflow. There is still some pores, which we have to remember is very good for pore. It has to interact with the environment that it's in. So we want to make sure there is some airflow so it can age. Now, with that being said, obviously for the long term, you don't want to break up a tea cake, store it in a jar, and then not drink it for a few years. Just because it's going to age a lot differently. It may be too much airflow, and it might remove some of that personality of the tea, of the dense, durable characteristics of that tea. But it's true, it'll probably age faster, right? Because there's more surface area of that tea. So that's something to keep in mind. So I like to pick out a few teas for the month, right? Maybe 2 raws and 2 ripes. And then I know those are the teas I'm going to drink. So I would break them up all at once and put them in the jar. So I have some raw and some ripe. With the goal being, I know I'm going to consume these teas in the next 1 to 2 months, right? Because I know I don't want it to be exposed and broken up for too long because that might affect the taste profile, but knowing I will drink those teas. Another important point to that is, I don't know if you ever tried just breaking up a tea brick and then you kind of get a lot of dust and it breaks and you take that small piece and you put it in your gaiwan. I'm sure you all have dealt with that, right? Well, if every time I want to go drink that tea, I'm breaking off that tea brick, just a small amount, I'm going to notice I'm going to have more dust and broken tea leaves. Where if I break it up all at once, right, I can avoid some of that dust and broken leaves. So that's my take on how to use these. Now, if you have a particularly young tea and you're trying to understand a tea, let's say a tea just was released, right, new harvest, spring new harvest, it was produced. I've mentioned about water vapor, right? When a tea is compressed and new and arrives, right, there's a little bit of bottle shock, and there's about 3 months of something called water vapor, which means during the pressing process, they take the mao cha, the loose leaves, they press it into a tea cake. There is water vapor trapped in that tea cake. So it's going to take sometimes up to 3 months for that water vapor to leave the tea cake and bring out its true flavor. So what happens when I drink tea with a lot of water vapor or new tea? Well, the characteristics of the tea tend to be muted. They tend to be muted and very difficult to understand the quality of the raw material. I think one of the hardest things to do is to understand the quality of the raw material from a new tea that's just been pressed, just been harvested. One, it tends to be very light, extremely, extremely light and muted. And so one thing I like to do in that situation is I take one of the new cakes I purchased, I would break it up in a jar, wait a week or two, increase that airflow, kind of reduce that water vapor faster to accelerate it, and then try that tea so I can get a better understanding of what this tea will turn into. Should I buy more? Because obviously there's a very particular window when a tea is first released. It's usually very affordable. Sometimes there's pre-orders. You can buy them in bulk. So that window to purchase that tea is very short. So I need to learn as fast as I can the quality of that material. So I use that a lot for new teas, break them up, put them in jars, wait a few days, and then drink them that way. So that's a great question. They also talked about Yixing clay jars. What about Yixing clay jars? Is that a good place to store tea? This is a very controversial question around Yixing. I have my own personal thoughts around Yixing. I think if you just look at the newspapers from 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, pretty well stated that there's no more Yixing clay. And then there's the argument of, oh, well, maybe there's a bunch of Yixing clay stored in warehouses somewhere, maybe. If you go to Yixing, where there used to be a mountain where they mined Yixing clay, it's literally a lake now. So one needs to thinking, what's the possibility I'm buying real Yixing? So that's very controversial. And I think, yes, I'm sure if you get good, clean, quality, natural clay that doesn't have a strong aroma, that's probably also a great idea to store tea in. Though natural clay jars, I tend to notice store ripe tea a little bit better than raw tea, just because it tends to be a little bit more earthen, intense, dark, right? And I like porcelain for raw. So if you did have the opportunity to have Yixing clay, that maybe would be for a ripe tea, etc. But I'm sure it would work fine with the raw. So hopefully that's helpful. Next question here we want to talk on is how do I store raw Pu-erh for the long term? This is a great question. So me personally, I store tea I have a friend's warehouse that I store some tea in Taichung, Taiwan. And I stored some tea in California, in Pasadena. And I have some here, but not a lot, because Seattle's very wet and damp, and it just really slows down the aging process of the tea pretty drastically. So how am I going to store tea? Well, we have to understand there are two kind of schools of thought in tea. There is the dry storage, and there is the wet storage. And I will just come off right now and say I am a very, very strong advocate towards dry storage. I think there are too many things that can go wrong in wet storage. Not to say that's unideal, right? I think there's natural wet storage. I think natural storage is always going to be better than artificial. So if I want to store tea for the long term, I should not be creating an artificial environment in my home to store tea. So what would an artificial environment be? I don't know. Adding in humidity, creating some type of humidor. I've seen people that have invested a lot in building these, and the majority of their collections, unfortunately, after a few years, develop mold. And they all, people always talk about how my humidor is so great, and they have all these blog posts, but they're never going to do a blog post about how all my tea became moldy, right? So that's a concern. I think always when you're storing Pu-erh, you want natural storage. And so then you need to look at your home climate. We do need to know that Pu-erh needs to interact with the environment. There needs to be some airflow. It cannot be airtight. If it is airtight, it should not be left airtight for too long. And if it is airtight for a long period of time, then you need to open the tea, let it breathe for sometimes a few days, sometimes a few weeks before you drink it, so it can bring back in its life. So Pu-erh is very much alive, so we need to be aware of that. So I store some teas in Taiwan. Why? Taichung is humid a few months of the year. And very, very humid. And then it's dry. It dries out, and then it's stored on the top store, like the fifth floor. There's small windows that we open every few weeks, right? We open some windows in the Pu-erh storage unit. Raw needs to be stored with raw. Ripe needs to be stored with ripe. That could be a closet, that could be a box, right? However you want to store it. And then you want a little bit of airflow. So sometimes that could be as easy as opening the door, opening the window, right? Once a week or once a month. You want a little bit of natural airflow. You don't want too much though, however. So if let's say I don't have a warehouse. I can't go buy a warehouse and store tea in. What am I going to do at home? So you can get something like a linen closet. Oh, it sounds funny. A linen closet, right? No, you want to keep it away from strong odors. You want to keep it away from sunlight, and you want to keep it away from excess humidity. And so what you can do is just keep a normal cardboard box, keep the original tongs, put them in the cardboard box, and then seal them, and then keep the raw with the raw box, the ripe with the ripe box, and then you can put them in your linen closet, and that should be fine, really. And so some people kind of worried, well, maybe it's not humid enough. It's okay if it's not humid enough. The only thing dry storage does is it slows down the aging process, which actually can be advantageous. It takes longer to age tea in a dry environment. It's true, it does take longer. But what I've noticed from dry storage teas is they preserve the natural personality, fragrance, and taste far better than wet or humid storage. Wet or humid storage will obviously accelerate the aging process, kind of muting the personality or dense characteristics of a certain tea. It's true, it'll taste like more aged tea. The color will be darker, the leaves will be darker, but you'll lose some of that personality. And so if you're gonna store them at home, just keep it really simple, right? Dry storage, put your raw with your raw. Don't use things like plastic or all these other things because that could contaminate the tea. Who knows what could happen, right? I like natural types of cardboard or boxes, and I keep my raw with my raw. And then if I purchase a tea, if I'm going to age it for a long period of time, just like you, I keep tongs and I'll buy it in a case, and they ship it to me in a case, and I just leave the tea in the whole case. I'll just put it in a warehouse or a closet. The reason I don't store tea, a lot of tea here in Seattle, is because it's very cold and it's very damp, and the aging process will take forever. One, because it's not very humid, it's very cold. You're going to need some heat to age tea. And it just takes so long to age tea. And I'm also worried that if we have a particularly wet or damp month, maybe there will be some mildew that will develop in the tea. That hasn't happened, thank goodness. But those are kind of my thoughts. Keep it simple. Simple is the ultimate sophistication, right? Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. It's a natural, alive thing. We don't need to think too much about it. Now, there's going to be another question probably about, well, what if I live in an environment that's just far too humid? It's just super humid, and if I don't do something with my tea, within a matter of weeks, it'll be moldy. Now, that's an extreme case, and that's where you can start to explore airtight systems or things that remove moisture. You just don't have any other option, unfortunately. And it's better to keep the tea away from mildew than it is to develop some kind of, kind of risk it, right? Especially if it's a large amount of tea. And it's okay to keep tea airtight for years, actually. Just be aware that if you keep pour airtight, it's not going to really age or develop. And if it does, it'll be very minimal. And then when you do open it up again, you have to let it breathe. You have to have some airflow, sometimes for days, sometimes for a week or two, to bring life back in to the tea. So I hope that's helpful, Matthew. Andrew said Jeffrey's Patreon is one of the best investments you can make in improving your knowledge and understanding of tea and the tea market. I appreciate that. That's very kind. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide something a little bit different, and hopefully it's valuable to you all. So any follow-up questions, feel free to ask them. I have a few other topics, but they aren't really urgent. So I'm gonna brew a brewing of tea, and then we can get into the next comments. But yeah, and also I think the way you want to think about that, and where did I get my knowledge for aging and storing pour? Well, I bought a lot of tea. I probably bought far too much tea, and I stored them all over. And I've had tea go moldy. I stored some tea on Orcas Island on my father's property. Went moldy, lost a massive investment. That was very disconcerting. I've stored tea in like some strange jars that I didn't know the origin of. For a number of years, and then a few years later, I noticed there was mildew in those teas, and then I've developed my own kind of humidor. I used to have a little bowl of liquid, and then a thermostat in my closet, and just so many things can go wrong. And now I realize that if I'm going to have a large investment in tea, I want to keep them in a dry environment. And for me, I like Taiwan storage because it accelerates the aging. But what I like to do is keep my teas in Taiwan for a few years and then pull them back into an extreme dry environment like California, to kind of halt that accelerated aging process. But hey, Noah, you sparked my love for Pu-erh. I'm sure you probably did that yourself. There's a lot of people on there, so I'm glad I could be a part of that. But I'm just another person drinking tea. Do you prefer aging your own teas, or do you like older varieties from the 80s and 90s? Now that's a loaded question, believe it or not. Um, so I think just out of the reality of the world we live in and prices and scarcity of Pu-erh, we already know that Pu-erh from old tea trees, right? Very scarce. Less than 3% of Pu-erh is from old tea trees, famous mountains. And then on top of that, if we go into aged Pu-erh, so 90s, 80s, we're looking at what, 30, potentially 30 to 40 years of age, and that's if they're authentic. What's the likelihood that we can easily, or I should say affordably, get a hold of teas like that? Well, I know that if I wanted to purchase some teas from the 1980s that were authentic and properly stored, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars easily. So that's a thing to be concerned of. And I do know you can get some tea on a website somewhere for $150, but to me, that's not logical. It does not make any sense. How is that possible that a tea from the 1980s, 1990s, on one site it's $120, and then teas in the 1890s, 1990s get auctioned off in Hong Kong for tens of thousands of dollars every month, right? So that's the first thing. So I wish I could drink aged tea. That is a true Pu-erh tea lover's dream, to drink authentic aged Pu-erh, because it is like medicine. And I've lucky enough to had opportunity to drink a few teas that were quite old. One of my favorite teas is actually Evening Fragrance Jade, Wansheng Yu, which is 1998. It's a Jingmai, famous mountain. It was one of the first productions of a older tea tree production from Jingmai. And I like that tea a lot, but now that tea is very, very expensive. And I think now I've settled in on, if I have the opportunity to drink old teas like that, and I find a good deal, I would of course take it up. But I'm now in the thought process of aging my own teas because of traceability. And if I purchase a tea, let's say, in 2017, and I age it for 10 years, well, I know that tea is 10 years old. I know that for a fact because I purchased that tea. So now I've kind of settled down and accepted the reality that for me to be able to drink and purchase a lot of aged tea is probably very unrealistic. And so now I'm in the boat of aging my own Pu-erh for that reason. No, that shouldn't stop you though. Like if you want to drink some teas and you have the opportunity to drink teas that are old, you should 100% do that and enjoy every moment of it. But I've also learned in my experience that if a tea is truly old, you should remember that the color is translucent, it is very aromatic, it is very clean, it's not opaque or cloudy or mildewy, right? And it will warm your stomach, warm your hands, warm your back, even sometimes making some people sweat. And aged tea is very much like medicine. So I really love aged Pu-erh, and if I have the opportunity to drink it, I do. But now I particularly age my own tea for that reason. Just because now every year famous mountains are getting more expensive, ancient arbor teas are getting outrageously expensive, and aged teas now are just, every year that passes by, there's more and more wealthy, educated people in Asia that are willing to spend ungodly amounts of money on aged tea. So I'm just going to accept the reality that I'll have a lot of wonderful, incredible aged tea when I'm 40 and 50, and I'm going to enjoy every moment of that. So, yeah, that's kind of my take on that. This is a typical Jeffrey move where I talk a lot and I forget to drink a few cups of tea. So I'm gonna get on that. If you join this live, go ahead and give it a like. That does help a lot because I'm trying to build this YouTube, get these live streams more public, so more and more people can learn about Pu-erh. What else? What else do you all want to talk about? There's a few people on here. Name a subject. Name something, and I'll talk on it. Or your experience, or what tea you've been drinking. I'm drinking the 2013 Wild Ripe. Now that's the tea that has the light fermentation, so it doesn't go through the traditional, normal wet piling. So that's why the color is not going to be as dark as some normal ripe teas. But this could easily fool some people into thinking this is a very, very old raw tea. And I've actually even seen some people rewrap that. That's a whole other conversation. What are the humidity percentage ranges for what you consider wet and dry storage? So I'm not going to have the answer you want to hear. I'm a little bit more traditional, I guess. I don't really get into the nitty gritty of the percentages and measuring it. For me, Hong Kong, humid storage, natural wet humid storage. Malaysia, almost too extreme. Malaysia may even be too much, where you may even risk mold. Taiwan is ideal for me because you only have 2 or 3 months of extreme humidity, which actually can be quite wet, but it's only for 1 or 2 months, so you don't risk molding because then it will dry out. So for me, it's more geographical. So California, obviously, for many reasons, is very, very dry, and so that's what I do for dry storage. So I don't have a humidity percentage. Sorry if that was not the answer you wanted. I do it more geographical, and if I notice there is a mildew that develops, then that's a concern. Another one is Indonesia, Bali. Almost impossible to age tea there because of the humidity all year round. But yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure other people online would have a more appropriate answer for you, but that's a great question. What flavors are in your stack of pizzas? So I know it's probably weird. Some people are like, what are you talking about? So there was a good friend in Danong, Daniel, who came in, and it was the first time he really got into pour, and he was drinking tea for a long time. Very knowledgeable about some Japanese teas too. And so he came in and he said, well, all the time I drink pour tea, I just didn't have a good experience with it because every time I drink it, I feel like I need to eat a stack of pizzas after I drink it because you're just so hungry, right? And so obviously that would be an undesirable characteristic to a good quality pour, right? No one wants to, feel like you need to eat a stack of pizzas after you drink tea. It's not a pleasurable experience, right? Just extreme violent hunger. And so that's where that reference comes from. We'll have an emoji of some stacked peaches here. So when someone's drinking a bunch of not so good tea, emoji storm, stack of peaches. But that was really enlightening because that was also, unfortunately, most people's experience. When I first got into tea, I drank a lot of wild tea because it made you feel crazy. And so I think that this tea must be amazing because it has such a strong effect on my body and mind that it must be some quality tea. When in reality, I realized later that it was just small bush tea with an insane amount of caffeine and tea polyphenols, which unfortunately is the case. So, and I used to drink a lot of teas where I would drink a few sessions. We're talking 2 or 3 sessions, and I would just need to go eat some very greasy, fatty foods. And that was for, unfortunately, most of my experience with pour in the beginning. And so later on, I started to get introduced to different qualities of tea. I started to second guess the teas I was drinking, and then I started to drink some aged teas that were very comfortable. I would drink some pour tea from old tea trees that made me almost want to take a nap and feel so comfortable in my stomach. And then I realized this is a very different experience. It's a very pleasurable experience. And there's a few things. One, teas from small bushes have a lot of tea polyphenols because they do not have deep root structures. So if they don't have deep root structures, then how are those tea trees living? Well, probably fertilizers or pesticides can maybe help them grow. And they have a lot of caffeine because that's what the tea tree makeup is. Now, teas from older tea trees, a few hundred years old, you have to think, have very, very deep root structures. Deep root structures can pull up an abundant amount of a variety of nutrition that gets pulled into the tree, meaning less tea polyphenols, less caffeine, and more unique personality and regional taste. So that's Ancient Arbor. And you'll notice when you drink those teas, you don't feel uncomfortable in the stomach. You don't feel huge amounts of caffeine. And I realized there was a whole new world of pour I needed to get introduced to. And so some people will just say, oh, raw is just, a huge gut bomb, or I can only drink it after I eat a bunch of really, greasy food, which is, maybe that will help. Eat a bunch of stack of pizzas or some fast food, maybe that type of tea will be beneficial. But not all pour tea is like that. And really good quality pour tea, you have to think some people are paying thousands of dollars for new tea, new raw tea from famous mountains. And do you think someone is paying $1,000 to make them feel caffeinated, uncomfortable in the stomach, and extremely hungry? No, that's not logical, right? They are paying so much money for that tea because it has such a serene, pleasant, comfortable experience. And that's why with Pu-erh, it is so important to focus on the feeling the tea gives you inside the body, the feeling of the tea inside the body, right? It's not just taste. And I do think Pu-erh is particularly unique in all the categories of tea because it has a unique feeling in the body, which can be very beneficial, right? And so we want to really pay attention to that. Good tea, let's keep it simple. Good tea should taste good and feel good. That's it, right? We don't have to overcomplicate it. And we shouldn't be getting undesirable effects or feelings from tea when we drink them, right? It should be a pleasant experience. And I'm going to talk about tea drunk in just a second. Let me get that. Let me get that $20 100 gram 1990s shung. Well, maybe in 1980 you could get some of that. Order a stack of pizzas. Yeah, I remember those days when I first got into tea. Just really, I mean, there's just so many things to go into that. But let's talk about tea drunk, cha chi. You probably have heard that term, tea drunkenness. How many of you all heard that? How many times have you tried to drink tea and be like, yeah, let's drink some tea? And this was actually one of my biggest faults, my biggest failures, was not understanding this concept. And when I first started doing tea in Macintosh tea, I would sell some teas. And the majority of my teas were actually from my tea masters. They were quite good quality. But then I said, you know what, I can do this myself. I can just go fly to China and go to visit some random tea farm and I can get good tea. Can't be that hard, can it? Famous last words. And so go in there, started to make up a lot of extravagant stories around my trips and journeys to be able to sell the tea more. And then I just noticed that most of the tea vendors, the tea was the same. It wasn't the same as my tea master's tea before. But I needed to have a very unique tea that was easy to be different than anything else that anyone else was selling. And so I came across wild tea. I actually came across wild tea of De Hong, Yesheng tea. Very cheap back then. And you can go visit kind of my apple tree analogy on this. I think I'm going to post that video next week for the public. But famous mountain tea is very expensive. We're talking thousands of dollars a kilo. Less famous mountain, but maybe old tea trees, maybe upper hundreds. Nowadays, maybe even higher. And then I found wild tea growing deep in the mountains, teas that were 400 or 500 years old, and they were selling it for $4 or $5 a kilo. How is that possible? Well, I'll tell you how that's possible. People in Yunnan and the surrounding areas do not drink wild tea because it is not fit for consumption. It's not fit for consumption. It's too aggressive on the stomach, and so that's why it's cheap. So price reflects quality and demand, and no one was buying wild tea back in the early 2000s. Now everyone sells it and it's ungodly expensive for some reason. But before it was very cheap, and so I was able to purchase 4 or 5 cakes for $4 or $5 a cake and then sell them for $40 or $50. And the thing with this wild tea was the color was bizarre, right? Purple, green, dark color, and when you drank it, you just feel whack. And so for me, I thought that was tea drunk because you just feel like you can't even focus and you don't even know where you are and you're just like, whoa, that's some crazy tea drunkenness. And so I could sell a lot of it. Now, later on, I realized that there was a reason why people did not drink this tea. And it's because it makes you feel too uncomfortable, right? And if you think about when they talk about tea drunkenness or cha chi or Lu Yu, right, the famous tea, Lu Yu who wrote that book, The Classic of Tea, do you think he was drinking tea and getting all messed up and being like, ooh, I can't write poetry? Probably not. He was probably drinking very good tea and feeling quite serene and meditative, right? Very, very focused, meditative, relaxed, and wanting to drink good tea and experience the tea ceremony and share that with his colleagues and learn about history and learn about scholarly subjects and poetry and calligraphy, right? And so there was really never a history of this wild tea. But now, unfortunately, with Famous Mountain and ancient arbor tea trees becoming so expensive and more fraudulent and mislabeled teas, more and more people are going to wild tea because it's cheaper. And the tea trees look the same. They're very old, the 500-year-old tea trees that are now affordable. They have a very unique taste profile. They look very different. But you have to realize that is not really what Pu-erh tea is. And it can be very damaging to the stomach. I drank a lot of wild tea and maybe very adversely affected my stomach and took years to recover. And there's a very high amount of caffeine. And so you want to be very careful with consuming too much wild tea because it could be detrimental to your health. And so now the reason there's a lot of wild tea is because Famous Mountain tea is just far too expensive, and so more and more wild tea is becoming on the market, and because more and more vendors are selling wild teas because it sells good and has a unique taste profile, that drives the price up because there is more demand. So before, there were two types of teas, right? Famous Mountains, and then you have wild tea, and this is maybe $4 or $5 a kilo, and this is a couple $100 a kilo. Well, this was too expensive, and this keeps getting more expensive, maybe a couple $1,000s a kilo. And this was then $10, $15, now $50, $100. And now it's more expensive, but the Famous Mountain is tenfold that price. So this still looks like a unique option. And so we have to remember, with any type of scarce commodity, you're going to unfortunately run into this problem. A few parallels are things like frankincense, agar wood. We're not trying to be, I don't know if that's the right word, like elitist or anything, but there's just only so much of that material in the world, and it's going to go to a very small percentage of the population, unfortunately, who have the resources to purchase that. And so that's the same with Pu-erh. Now, luckily, there are more and more small plantations and people that are finding high elevations and mountains that are using organic farming methods, but still, you're going to need, another 50, 80 years for these teas to start to develop to get that characteristic of old tea trees. So it's a very convoluted subject and it takes time to digest, but just be aware that good tea should make you feel good, should make you feel relaxed. You should not have any focusing problems, of course. And it should be very soothing, right? It's very warming, it's very comforting, like a good friend. You drink a tea and it's like you're drinking, spending time with a good friend. So keep that in mind when approaching Pu-erh. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. My favorite thing is people will say like a tea has aging potential. What in the world does that mean? And maybe it's because the tea's not tasty, so we need to say it has aging potential, so then you can buy it or sell it. Pu-erh is more simple than most people give it credit, right? If the tea tastes good today, it'll probably taste good tomorrow and for a year from now, etc. But if the tea doesn't taste good today, it's not going to taste good in the future, right? Like, if it's strong and bitter and astringent, and it's not going to turn into something amazing in 10 to 15 years, because the characteristics it has now is what it has to work on and develop from. So the raw material, the foundation of that tea has to be enjoyable and good to be good later on, right? A bad quality tea is only going to be a bad quality tea later on. So be careful about terms that say like, aging potential, or it's so strong and pungent and potent and it'll turn to something beautiful in old age. Unfortunately, it probably won't. Because we have to remember, strong characteristics, strong taste profiles usually are coming because the tea is overly aggressive, or maybe there's too many tea polyphenols, maybe there's too much caffeine, and it may be more and more aggressive. Now, there is another subject that I guess we can talk about, which is Banzang and Pu-erh, which are two very famous mountain regions. And just to give you perspective, Banzang a year or so ago, for a kilo or two, we're talking like $50,000 to $100,000. I mean, absurd. And most of that is just the wealthy population in China, because it's such a culturally significant mountain. And from old tea trees, it's even harder. And so some people will drink Pu-erh and Banzang, and they say, "Oh, it's so bitter. It's so bitter." And it's true. Those mountains do have a more aggressive taste profile. But I've been lucky enough to drink some authentic Banzang and Pu-erh, and I can tell you that yes, it's bitter, but it's more so like a Chinese bitter medicine that does not pierce the palate, and it does not stay dry on the palate. It does not leave bitterness in the mouth. It does not leave a unpleasant taste profile in the mouth, and it does not leave an uncomfortable feeling in the stomach. And so, while teas can be more aggressive, they still have a beauty. Banzang and Pu-erh, when you smell the aroma of the dry leaves, it's almost like perfume. And so that's something to keep in mind, that if those teas are so expensive, we have to thinking about this. Do you think someone is paying so much money for something that is unpleasant and bitter and astringent it doesn't feel good, and I can only drink it every once in a while. No. Someone is paying so much money because it has a very unique characteristic that is scarce, hard to understand, hard to discover, and very pleasant to drink all the time. And that's actually why I developed the 3-day rule, which if you haven't heard that, there's a live stream I did with Rye of Tea Curious about the 3-day rule, which I recommend you all go watch if you haven't watched it. And the 3-day rule is, if you really want to test your knowledge if this tea is good or not, find a tea you like, only drink that tea every day for 3 days. 3 times a day. And there's a kitty over there. Because the purpose of that test is not to see if you can endure the 3 days. No, the test is to the test is to see if after 3 days. Come on, kid, get out of here. I'm sorry, everyone. The test is if after 3 days of drinking the same tea, do you still crave the tea? Do you still want to drink the tea? Is it still a pleasant experience? Because if you do, I mean, that's quite the statement of a good quality tea, right? Continuing you craving it. It's quenching your thirst. It's so enjoyable. It's so comfortable. But if you drink it, the first day, the second time the same day, and then the second day in the morning you drink it, you say, this tea is so boring. I've had enough of this tea. It just makes my palate dry. Well, that's very revealing on the quality of the tea. So that's why I think the 3-day rule is so important, because I've experienced with good quality Pu-erh, you can drink the same tea day after day and still be craving that tea. So unique. And you can't really get this feeling from small bush Pu-erh because it's kind of dry, it's caffeinated, it feels a little uncomfortable. But with really good quality older tea tree material, I noticed that the tea, as crazy as it may sound, is almost thirst quenching. Thirst quenching. Imagine that. Imagine drinking tea that is somewhat thirst quenching, because we know most teas are diuretics, right? So how could a tea be thirst quenching? Well, really good quality Pu-erh has a feeling of thirst quenching because the old tea trees have such an abundant amount of nutrition. Now, it's not to say that it's not a diuretic anymore, it's just less so, right? So the 3-day rule, very, very fundamental to understand. What do you think causes the tea drunk feeling? So that's good. That's a good question. What do you think causes the tea drunk feeling? Well, I think there's two types of tea drunk, and they're caused by different things. Sometimes, depending on what tea community you're in, sometimes tea drunkenness is just feeling crazy and whacked out and woo, I just feel funky. Well, that's caused by an overdose of caffeine and too many tea polyphenols and probably wild tea. And so that is not what I acquaint tea drunkenness with. I think tea drunkenness, historically when people talked about it, was when you drink a very good tea. And you'll notice this with old tea trees, really good quality Pu-erh. You drink it, and after a few cups, you feel just refreshing, thirst quenching. You feel so soothing. You just feel so relaxed. And if you drink a very good quality Pu-erh, you will almost feel like you want to take a nap or meditate after drinking. That is really the comfortable tea drunk feeling that I relate to what is tea drunk. So I have this experience often when I drink Jingmai King of Trees. I'll drink a few infusions and I'll just want to go like lie down. I just too comfortable, just too relaxed. I just need to go lie down for a while. And that feeling can be sometimes quite extreme. If you haven't drunken a particularly high quality tea in a long time and you have the opportunity to drink a really good quality tea, it'll be almost extreme, almost like you really do need to go take a nap. But I do notice that if you drink the same tea, let's say I was fortunate enough or crazy enough to drink Jingmai King of Trees, 6 to 7 days in a row, then maybe that tea drunken feeling would be reduced slightly. And that does happen. I don't actually know why it happens, but I have noticed that it is good to rotate your tea collection. One once you understand the quality of the raw material and you have the teas you like and you've done the 3-day rule, then you can start to separate your teas, right? And then you want to kind of do a nice rotation of teas, drinking some Least Raws, a little bit of Famous Mountain. I drink Famous Mountains more infrequently now, just because of the price, but also the very comfortable feeling. So I've been very spoiled to drink maybe too much Famous Mountain before, and now I just feel way too spoiled. But that's the only type of teas I want to drink. So be careful of that trap too. But a little bit of rotation is healthy after you've done the 3-day rule. So it's not so weird. I don't know what that question is. That comment was held. I don't know why. I guess we can share that comment. I don't know what that is though. So yeah, we got a few more minutes here. If you got any last minute questions, now is the time. I'm gonna drink another infusion here, and then we can start wrapping things up. If you want to learn more, if you want to know more about the teas I'm drinking, what teas I'm drinking, we want me to build an inventory collection for you, etc., feel free to jump on my Patreon. The Patreon has more exclusive live streams. So these live streams go into more in depth of my market experience with more controversial topics such as Yixing and brands and things like that. So we cover all that in my live stream. And the greatest benefits to Patreon is the archive live streams, which is quite a few now, oh my goodness, and being able to ask me questions directly. And then also being able to help recommend and talk about your tea collection in a more detailed, personal setting. So feel free to jump on to my Patreon and kind of connect with the community there. We do live streams about twice a month. I'm probably going to be doing YouTube live streams, I think every other month, one time. I think that's the goal for now. We might speed things up once there's kind of a little bit more of a following, once we get a little bit more people tuning in, but right now that's kind of the game plan. And the spring season's coming along. Winter is gone now. Can't believe it. So pre-orders are coming up. That'll be fun. Pre-order spring season will be the next thing on the horizon. So I always like going through the pre-orders. What teas we're going to buy, how they're changing, things of that nature. Kettles I use below, in the comments below, in the descriptions if you want to know where I get these. I have a few videos on telling the difference between these two as well. Alrighty, y'all, that's your chance. One more question, topic you want me to cover while I'm on live. I'll stay on here for a few more minutes, and then we'll call it a night. Also, if you're still watching, what do you want to see on my YouTube channel? What do you want to see in these live streams, future live streams? Are there any topics you want me to cover? I'm happy to kind of get into some more broad topics. I particularly focus on Pu-erh, understand the quality of raw Pu-erh only, but we do jump around a little bit on tea kettles or some teaware. But I try to focus on Pu-erh. Stay there. The thing I like about this, the 2013, the wild teas, the wild brick teas. So this wild tea we're drinking is very different than the wild tea I was talking about before. In wild teas, the majority of which are on the outskirts of Yunnan, are usually not fit for consumption. But there's a few wild teas that, while not good for raw, you can play with them as a ripe pour. And so that is one thing I've noticed happened in the last 15 years or so. People have started to play with using those wild teas to make ripe pour. It had some very successful results, actually, because it's too harsh to drink as raw. But this is essentially a light fermentation where you're getting some of that wild characteristic, and you're not doing a full fermentation. And it actually makes the tea very aromatic, very fruity, like more fruity than a normal ripe. And it really does taste like a much older raw, which is quite unique. I like your updates on teas over time. So, yeah, what tea should we get an update on? I feel like the 2013, 2010 wild teas are still the same as they've always been. They age so slow. And then The Mountain Oasis, well, mine's in Taiwan, so I'm a little cheating there. So it's accelerating a little bit faster than others. But I'll cover that in the next Patreon live stream. We'll go into all the individual teas and the updates on that. I think that will be fun. All right, we'll go deep dive next Patreon live stream. We'll get into the nitty gritty of some of those teas. So pre-orders, HLC. So pre-orders, there's usually a number of companies that will do pre-orders in the spring. I don't myself produce teas at all. I just do it mostly for hobby, education purposes. I've been in the industry for a long time. I used to do that, but I no longer do that now. And so on Patreon, we kind of just go through the teas that are offering the pre-orders, the companies that are. We kind of diagnose them as they get released. I give my thoughts on them and seeing what's kind of a good purchase, what's not a good purchase. Because usually pre-orders, you can usually get a discount if you purchase the tea before it arrives, which is crazy. Why would you buy tea you haven't tasted yet, right? So that's where you have to really do your technical analysis in the quality of the companies you buy tea from to ensure that trust. So that usually happens every spring. Some companies even have autumn pre-orders, right? So they do a new production and then they're kind of released. These are the teas we're producing, and they'll kind of have special pricing before the teas are released. So that's what the pre-orders are. I'm telling you, if you don't drink one of these wild ripe teas for a long time and then you drink it, so comfortable. So soothing, just like warm. Alrighty, y'all. I think that is a wrap. Thank you so much for joining in. Thanks for your support. We'll be posting more and more videos in the coming weeks, so keep an eye, hit that subscribe, like button, and then we'll be posting more and more kind of short educational videos, and then we'll be doing more live streams. And you can learn about where I'll be going live on my Patreon or in the Facebook group we have on Facebook, or you can just subscribe to the YouTube channel and you'll get a notification. So thanks so much for joining today. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and look forward to seeing you on the next video. Take care, y'all. Anytime.